Hola, bienvenidos al ciclo de entrevistas de Fundación Hypatia. Estamos muy felices de estar en México, en el Tecnológico de Monterrey, que nos ha invitado a hacer este ciclo con ellos. Queremos agradecer especialmente a la Cátedra Alfonso Reyes por haber aceptado traer a Jem Bendell a México, haber traducido su libro Breaking Together al español, que se llama Cayendo Juntos, y que Jem lanzó en Monterrey, en la Feria Internacional del Libro de Monterrey hace unos días, y ayer en el Huerto Roma Verde en Ciudad de México. Así que vamos a presentar a Jem. Es un honor, Jem. It's an honor to be here with you today. Thank you so much for all what you're doing in Mexico to spread the message of your book, and welcome and thank you for being here.
Yeah, I've enjoyed myself so far. It's been a surprise to have had so much fun coming here. Yeah.
We are going to introduce you first. Estamos con el escritor, académico y activista inglés Jem Bendell, quien está en México para hacer el lanzamiento de Cayendo Juntos, una respuesta compasiva y eco-libertaria al colapso. Él es fundador de la Iniciativa para el Liderazgo y la Sostenibilidad de la Universidad de Cumbria, en Inglaterra, co-fundador de la Advertencia de Académicos Internacionales sobre Disrupción y Colapso Social y autor del polémico ensayo Adaptación Profunda, que en el año 2018 se hizo viral, dividió a la ciencia climática y hizo explotar las protestas públicas en contra de la inacción climática en Inglaterra, incluyendo también un fuerte impulso al grupo activista Extinction Rebellion. Y este ensayo, en solo 1 año y medio, fue descargado por más de 1 millón de personas, algo muy poco usual para los artículos académicos, y generó un movimiento internacional con miles de personas en distintos puntos del globo, que integran una comunidad de reflexión, apoyo mutuo, adaptación al cambio y adaptación al cambio de vida y formas de trabajo en el que estamos todos producto de este colapso de la crisis sistémica, climática, ecosistémica. Este ensayo, que se los recomiendo mucho de bajar y leer, ha sido traducido a 3 idiomas y está siendo traducido a 9 idiomas más. Por esto, después del ensayo, vino el libro Breaking Together, que es el que viene a lanzar a México y a toda Hispanoamérica, con una detallada evidencia científica sobre el desastre producido a la biosfera y a la humanidad por nuestra sociedad industrial de consumo. Así que vamos a ir a la entrevista. Jem ha estado hablando de este libro ya por 1 año y sobre su evidencia científica, sobre toda la data dura. Por lo tanto, como siempre en Hypatia, vamos a centrar la entrevista en el proceso interno que él ha vivido con este libro, lo que ha visto que se ha desarrollado alrededor en las comunidades a través de la emergencia de este libro y cómo se está desarrollando esta nueva inteligencia o movimiento a través del libro Cayendo Juntos. So let's go to the interview, Jem, and thank you again for being here with the Hypatia Foundation. You started very, very young as an environmentalist, like at 14 years old, an activist and change agent. Then you become an expert in sustainability and you advise international organizations like the UN, Davos, etc. So I'm going to start reading in Spanish a fragment of Cayendo Juntos, his book, about this work that he did for many years. Cito a Jem: por varios años asistí a las cumbres de Davos con la esperanza de poder ayudar a promover un compromiso serio con la crisis medioambiental. Lo que no sabía es que lo único peor que las élites del mundo no se tomaran en serio el cambio climático sería que se lo tomaran en serio. Las ideas y políticas que surgen en Davos se centran en conseguir más dinero público para empresas privadas con dudosas credenciales ecológicas y en crear infraestructuras digitales para el control de la gente ordinaria. Lo que las élites mundiales no tienen en cuenta es cómo sus propias ideas, visiones del mundo y decisiones llevaron al mundo al borde del colapso. y cómo debido a ese historial no son las personas más indicadas para decidir qué hacer al respecto. Entonces, our question is, Jem, how come that so intelligent leaders with so much resources are completely blind to the negative impacts of their solutions?
I can only guess what that section is because my Spanish isn't up to it. But I think you were saying it's the section where I say I didn't realize that one thing worse than the elites ignoring climate change would be the elites taking climate change seriously.
Exactly,
or
that
something
one.
along those lines.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so. Yeah, you're right. Since I became concerned about the environment and saw it in connection to economy and society, I thought, wow, I need to use my skills, networks, luck, good fortune, to engage at the highest levels, to have the biggest positive impact worldwide that I could. I thought there's loads of people out there who can do one permaculture project or save one little patch of forest, but we have a systemic problem. The way global capitalism seems to be driving the destruction of the planet, and because I think, I must be pragmatic, we have to somehow reform that, change that.
Mm-hmm.
To do that, we need to have the biggest NGOs in the world and the biggest companies in the world and the biggest banks in the world working with enlightened leaders in politics to redirect capitalism. The idea was internalizing the externalities, so making polluters pay and putting a price on carbon and putting even maybe a price on biodiversity loss, so that we would somehow have an economy that would be more sustainable, and then the companies would be rewarded for that by consumers and investors liking them more than the others. That was the paradigm that I worked in for decades, as a bit of a leader in that, with books and with my jobs in various different places, as you said. And that's also why I was, over time, welcomed at higher levels in the international sphere, because corporations were waking up to this, and so corporate sustainability was growing since when I started my first job in this area in 1995. And yet, what I've seen is business leaders understandably want to respond to whatever issue it is, toxic pollution, deforestation, climate change, whatever it is, in a way where it doesn't cost them very much and it's likely to make them more money. That's just how it works. So we're always talking about the business case. That fundamentally limited what we could do. And we have seen over the decades that although many companies have tried, many passionate executives in companies have tried, it's added up to nothing. All the indicators, the global indicators on species loss, habitat loss, toxification of the environment, emissions of carbon, greenhouse gases, climate change, it's all been going in the wrong direction. So we've kind of all been swimming against the tide. So that's a realization that's very painful for many people. It was very painful for me. So one of the reasons why people keep doing the same thing is purely the pain of realizing that it's not working and they don't know what to do. So that's one thing. But you've also asked, why are many other leaders so oblivious to this? When we have had information in the mass media about all these problems for as long as I can remember. And I think it's because you said, you mentioned the word intelligent. I don't, in some of the meetings I've been to at the highest levels with the most successful people, I haven't experienced intelligence. I've experienced people who are in a rush, people who are extremely managed by their teams to deliver a performance of power. So I don't think any of them have any power. They're involved in a performance of power with a team around them, whisking them from one meeting to the next, where they're told what to do and say. And so there's no real time and space for thinking, for introspection. And also many of these people in top jobs, they've arrived at that through a specialism. Say they may have been really good in finance and accounting, and then they end up as CEO. I mean, so many of these people with power have very narrow life experience, very narrow training. And then because of that, they rely on whatever's considered common sense in a whole range of areas where they actually don't know anything. And so they're just like cogs in a machine. They're not real creative, critical thinkers. And the few that are, again, this sense of rush and a limited scope for, if you're the head of a big bank like HSBC, you've got to be thinking about share price and your employees. And so the way you're going to look at climate change, it's way down the list. So we don't seem to have systems that would naturally produce leaders that would think about the common good for humanity. And so into that void, you have some corporate leaders speaking about what to do for humanity, but it has to fit with what I was saying, which is shareholder value and making more money. And they're not necessarily the most intelligent or well-educated people on the complexity of the situation we're in and what to do about it. So, I mean, I could go into other stuff like, there are theories about what kinds of people aspire to be at the top of big hierarchies. But meeting these people, some of them became friends, or at least we were friendly for the time I was moving in those spaces. There's nothing evil there at all. The one thing that I would say is there is a story that one needs to be confident, and that's really unhelpful. I think that means you, and so we see that with politicians. Politicians always need to have an answer for everything. There's no vulnerability. It also happens in the corporate sector as well, and even in NGOs, this wanting to be confident. And that's false confidence, particularly now we're in a situation where things are breaking down. We've not been in this situation before. Anyone who's confident about what to do is talking bollocks.
Jem, you became famous due to your deep adaptation essay. What internally made you write this article, and how your life, seeing from now, how your life has changed since then?
So the way I've approached environmental work since my first job, or before my first job, I became an environmentalist, as you say, kind of woke up to how bad things were in 1988. So my choice of even the subjects I did at school, not only the topic at university, but the papers the modules I would do was all with environmental problems in mind, and the fact that I was going to be a professional environmentalist of some sort. So it was never just a job, it was not a career, it was a vocation. And so I did keep thinking, is what I'm doing adding up to much? And climate change was always a context, but it was always something that I thought that if we didn't achieve a change in fossil fuel use by, I guess, 2050, then we'd have a terrible problem by 2100. And why did I think that? As a professional working in environmentalism, why did I have that sort of general idea that it's really sad for the polar bears now, but it's only really going to be a problem for us at the end of the century, us, humans. And I think it was partly because now I realize there was a filtering or a watering down of the message of danger. So that first happened at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change with the seeking of consensus. So therefore, it wasn't necessarily the most salient papers that would be communicated. They would try and just find consensus amongst a huge volume of research. And so that would reflect where the money was going for the research. And so much of it was going into computer modeling. Whereas I believe the most salient research to understand the future of the climate is to understand the nature of the Pacific Ocean, what's going on there. And we've seen that now. The people who study the Pacific Ocean are the least wrong or the most accurate of all the climatologists in terms of what we're seeing now in 2024 with world temperatures and ocean temperatures. But that was filtered then by the media, because journalists would seem to water it down even more. And the bureaucrats, the public spokespersons as well, would kind of make it a little bit easier for policymakers. And so by the time I didn't read the IPCC reports, I didn't read the original climatology. I was too busy being a corporate sustainability person, doing teaching and doing all sorts. I was super happy if I got LVMH, the luxury multinational, to adopt a new sustainability policy. That was more my focus. But I knew over time that I was seeing in the news evidence that climate change was going much faster than what I had thought or been led to believe. I think really what was most important for me was around 2013, where it became about over 30 degrees Celsius within the Arctic Circle, and there were forest fires in the tundra in the Arctic, and there was evidence of permafrost melting and leading to methane explosions. And I knew this was what's called a self-amplifying feedback within the climate system, where then, because we changed the climate a bit, made it a bit warmer, this meant that the climate would heat itself up because of methane would be released from the permafrost, and that's a very intense greenhouse gas. So I saw all that and I parked it away because I was busy being a successful professional. But by the time it came March 2017, I was on holiday with my friends in the Alps, and he was a guy who worked at the UN, and he had a similar kind of interest in reflecting on how things are going, what's the contribution we're making, what's the state of the world. And I said, I don't believe in what I'm doing anymore. It feels like I have to drag myself back into the university office. And I used to have a passion for what I was doing, but I can't. And the thing is, I want to know more about how bad it might be, and whether my plan, my efforts on what is incremental reform of global capitalism, basically greening capitalism, was basically what I was trying to do. Does that make sense anymore? So I wrote from his chalet in the Alps to my boss saying, I need to take a year off unpaid leave, because I knew if I tried to put in for a sabbatical, then that would be probably years away and be only 4 months. And I knew in England, we've got problems with money in universities. So if you write to your boss saying, do you want to save a year's worth of my salary? And there we go. So that's what happened. And then that's when I then created time to go into the climate science, read the papers themselves, and also take my approach, which is, what do I think is most salient to know? So, for example, there was a paper in 2017 by 2 scientists that studied the Pacific and how the Pacific affects world climate. And they said, well, with the way the Pacific Oscillation works and the El Nino, if we have an El Nino, then we calculate that we might go through the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold above pre-industrial temperatures around about 2025. So they said that in 2017. Now, the following year, October 2018, the IPCC put out a report on staying below 1.5. And it was the most radical report IPCC had ever done. But they were saying, we have to cut carbon emissions by half by 2030 to have a 50% chance of staying below 1.5 by around 2050. So an entirely different story. And here we are in 2024, and the last 12 months have been 1.64 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial temperatures. So 2023 was about 1.5 degrees C above. So 2023, so that's 5 years after the IPCC put that report out. We're already there. I mean, we may see a tiny bit of cooling, but it's not much with El Nino decreasing. So, yeah, it's... So what your question was, what was happening in me? A little bit of panic, cognitive dissonance, it's called. My job no longer felt like it was my truth. And then once I started reading some of the primary science with my own approach, which is what does everyone think, but what's the most important science to try and understand what reality is, I ended up with a shocking conclusion to me, and then at that point I thought, wow, I'm not going back to my job. I can't. And it doesn't feel right to just leave without telling other people in my profession what I think I've concluded. And also, I'll admit it, there was some anger. I was angry because it wasn't just a joy doing my job over those decades. I had been motivated a little bit by this idea of sacrifice. Like it was good to work extra hard and take risks, and it was somehow worthy that I didn't therefore pay attention to other aspects of my life. I didn't learn another language. I didn't learn a musical instrument. I didn't get better at tennis, although I loved it. I didn't really learn how to be a good partner in relationships. I didn't save any money. I often had real stressful times at work because I was challenging bosses for not being ambitious enough, and I got kicked out of a couple of organizations for being such a annoying young pain in the ass. So there was a bit of anger there in me. It's like, what the hell? Why didn't I know this? Why has this been hidden? And I've kind of given my life to something which isn't adding up to much. So there was that in there as well. So there was a bit of like, before I'm going, I'm going to tell you how bad it is. But then as I got into it, I thought I can't leave people with just the bad news. Just can't do that. I got to talk about why do we deny it and how can we talk about it? So then I came up with a deep adaptation framework, which is a series of guiding questions for how we can begin to talk about this. If it's too late to stop catastrophic climate change, collapsing modern societies, how do we talk about it? Because most people would just say, well, may as well do nothing then. No, just go on holiday. No. What are we going to do that's useful? Well, we're, as I said earlier, we're in a totally new situation, so let's have a way of talking about it. So then the second half of the paper was less angry. it's more just, how do we talk about this?
Yeah, and after the paper, this explodes. No, as I say before, 1 million people downloaded that paper and they sent it to friends and how this movement of the Deep Adaptation Forum emerged, and what has happened with those communities that meet all over the world to process this information, to reflect together, to hold each other, and and how many countries more or less today, if you know, they still doing it.
So yeah, the deep adaptation was the name of the paper, but it was also a name or a label for an ethos, which is to accept societal collapse as either likely, inevitable, or already underway as a process. Don't know how it's going to unfold, but things are breaking down and we can't just fix them. So it's an ethos of responding to that in a positive, collaborative, kind way, rather than the negative, defensive, let's build a bunker, let's learn how to keep out the foreigners, all that kind of Mad Max mentality. It was an invitation to actually respond positively to the predicament. So that's what deep adaptation as a phrase came to be known as.
Mm-hmm.
I know that some people who have a very popular, say, book, just think, oh, well, I'm an author now. I don't know, Naomi Klein, No Logo, 2000. Exploded around the world as a book, critiquing capitalism and all that. She stayed as an author, as a journalist.
Mm-hmm.
For me, I had a lot of people reaching out to me, heartbroken. And so it didn't feel right to do nothing about that. I had a lot of people writing to me, asking me, what should be done in all areas of life, everything.
Mm-mm.
It was kind of insane. So I decided to just try and connect them all. And so, I managed to, one of the people who got in touch offered money for me to pay some people to work in creating the Deep Adaptation Forum, which was founded on the idea of providing ways of people coming together to talk about what to do. And so we focus very much on facilitation, so ways of meeting and talking and exploring what to do. Yes, that happens a lot in different countries.
Mm-hmm.
And then obviously the pandemic disrupted that. So the Deep Adaptation Forum, therefore, itself became mostly just an online entity. And it is somewhat connected to all the national groups, but not really. So it's like the Deep Adaptation Forum is more like an international forum where people who prefer that kind of international networking, perhaps because they haven't got a local group,
Mm-hmm.
and they focus mainly on the emotional, psychological processing and support, which is very helpful because a lot of people need that, particularly when they first wake up to this. So it's a global community of care, really.
Mm-hmm.
But then there are deep adaptation groups all over the world doing their own thing. The biggest one is in Hungary. They're huge and they meet regularly and they're doing all kinds of things, from getting together to learn how to start doing community vegetable allotments, getting together to decide how to develop a new curriculum for children at different ages, and then how they're going to get that into schools in the national curriculum. They're doing all sorts of things. It's just once you provide a different framework, which is you can't assume progress, more industrial consumer goods, more of the same. That's not your future. Things will be breaking around you. The market system and government support will be breaking around you. That's a new paradigm to discuss what to do if you want to help each other and in your community. But it's different in different countries. So in India, the deep adaptation community in southern India, they mobilized immediately when the lockdowns came, because that stranded so many migrant workers in construction in India. Suddenly no money, and literally 1,000 or more miles from home. And so they mobilized to help feed them and help them with the money to get back home. So, it's different in different places. And what the Deep Adaptation Group in India said was they switched. They switched from what they were doing before, which might be environmental sustainability. They set the Deep Adaptation Group. It came out of environmental groups. They had a collapsology group as well, but the Deep Adaptation Group, once it was formed, had this sense of how do we want to be as people in disaster, in emergency. So they'd had all those conversations. So they told me that because of that, when COVID happened and hit, and they had this terrible problem with the migrant workers, it was immediate. that they would help in that humanitarian spirit. If they were still just meeting and talking about purely environmental green things, then it didn't have this sense of trying to help people with disasters and setbacks and disruptions. Maybe they wouldn't, maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't. But they say that it really did help.
Right.
So it's different in different places. And I can't answer your question about how many groups and how many
No,
people.
yes, but you responded perfectly. The impact of these groups and the Deep Adaptation Forum in the world. In your book, Cayendo Juntos, you prove with a lot of data, many subjects, that our industrial consumer civilization is collapsing. But can you give us just a couple of examples, maybe not well known? So people who doesn't understand or is confused with the collapse concept, to understand what is really collapsing. Okay.
Yeah. So I guess, no, I'm guessing here, but many of the people who might come across this video will be in the field of, or interested in, or at least heard of, sustainable development, desarrollo sostenible, and the Sustainable Development Goals. And what I realized is that when the world's leaders were in New York signing the Sustainable Development Goals, proudly committing to achieve all these wonderful things for improving environment, reducing poverty by 2030, the data shows that most of their countries that year were already beginning their persistent decline in all manner of indicators. So not only have we not achieved any of the SDGs, we're going backwards on many of them. But that's, if we look at, say, the main index on human development, it's called the Human Development Index. It's been around since, I think, 1990, produced every year for maybe all countries of the world. In 90% of countries since 2019, that's been going down. Now, that includes things like life expectancy, something as basic as life expectancy, but also chronic disease, crime levels. And it also includes things like nutrition, malnutrition, pollution, all sorts. Now, it wouldn't be surprising if anyone watching didn't know that. We are told by the media and by our politicians that any problems that we're experiencing at a national level are to do with a particular problem, like that war, that stupid politician, that bad group of people, that particular hurricane. It's always that. But no, this is everywhere. So if it's everywhere, there are causes that are happening everywhere. And of course, it's worse than that. You've got Numbeo quality of life data, which shows that in the majority of countries, quality of life has been going down since around 2016. And also, when I mentioned those two dates, but when you look at the indices, you go down to a granular level, you realize some of the data is only 6 months old, but some of the data is even 2 years old. So it shows you this has been going on even longer. And then if opinion polls around the world show that now the majority of people in the majority of countries no longer believe the future will be better than today, and no longer believe their children will have a better life than they do, or they have had. And that doesn't mean they're being a bit pessimistic, or that somehow humanity is having a bit of confidence crisis. It's actually showing us that people, through their experiences, through their intuition, know what the data is also showing. But we're not being allowed to talk about it. When we are talking about it, when anyone says that this is happening in public, they say, so we're either going to fix it with a new technology, or we're going to fix it by going back to traditional values. So we're going to make America great again. We're going to take back control in Britain from the European Union. We're going to re-elect a Marcos dictator type person in Philippines. It's all to set the clock back. Or the other story is new technology, get the smart technocrats in charge again, get rid of the silly people, and then we'll fix everything. These seem to be the only two stories we've got in the mainstream political sphere. So my book is saying, well, that's all nonsense. People know it's nonsense, but that we're not being allowed to talk about it in public. We're in an era of regress, not progress. Accept it. What are we going to do about it? How can we have a kind of fairer way of dealing with this difficult situation?
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about the root of our financial system damage. We know about a lot of damages, no? The oil industry damage, the biodiversity loss, the old school agriculture damage, the pesticides, the toxics. We mentioned that, no?
Yes, and all that's adding up to crumbling the foundations, which are leading to, or the cracks on the surface that I was just explaining, all those indicators.
Exactly.
So they relate to problems in food, energy,
yes.
biodiversity, climate. So yes, so those foundations are now so fractured that we are beginning to experience the consequences in society, in our quality of life, standard of living. And so that's what collapse is that it's a breaking that can't be repaired.
Yes.
Doesn't mean we can't help, but it won't be the same.
Exactly. So in Cayendo Juntos, you say our financial system is parasitic. How do you say parasitic or parasitic?
Yeah.
Parasitic.
How do you say that in Spanish?
Parasítico, parásito. It's a parasito. Okay. And completely out of control. Can you explain a little bit how this system, this financial system, is in the root of this?
Yeah, unless we don't explore the root of this global predicament that we've just talked about, then we risk making matters worse as we try to respond. That's why I thought in my book I should really look at why we got into this predicament, and to explore how it's not just an accident, but it's the inevitable outcome of the economic and social systems that we have. And if you look at that, I mean, obviously there's been a very long critique of capitalism and a very controversial set of attempts at political alternatives, some of them okay and many of them disastrous, and then abusive responses to those alternatives. So like the extreme imperialist capitalism. So it's quite a tough history if you're gonna and people feel quite awkward talking about pro-capitalism, anti-capitalism. In my book, I go a bit deeper than that and look at the monetary system and talk about something which is not that well known. A group in the UK did a survey of politicians about how is money created, and 8 out of 10 of them didn't know. They had the wrong answer. They kind of thought it might be the central bank printing it or whatever. So the way our money is created is by private banks when they issue loans. So that's just they type in
the computer.
They type in the computer, and that's your loan. And what they get in return is the collateral, is the loan agreement, and that's an asset to them, which is your agreement to pay it back. But the vast majority, in nearly all economies of the world, well over 90% of all the money in circulation is purely so-called deposits, but basically electronic entries in the banking system, which was initiated through a loan. And that acts as money, because, if we go and we pay for a coffee, say, with our card, that's all just numbers being settled out between the banks. So that's the money we're using today. The thing is, those loans, the banks decide who to give it to and for what and at what price. So we end up with, so those loans are a form of purchasing power.
Mm-hmm.
So they're a form of an ability to do something in society. And guess what? To pay other people to do things in society. So we end up with a society which is imagined in the minds of the bank managers. What's best for them? Most return, least risk, most profit, yeah? So most of the money they lend is for property for 30 years, and they get 3 times the money back in mortgages. So that means we have massive, so that's why you end up with real estate price inflation, which means everyone therefore gets worried about paying their rent, paying their mortgage, and therefore then they decide to go into careers they never really wanted to because they're worried about how they're going to afford a house. And then they get into debt for 30 years. And like most of the people I know do jobs because they have to pay the debts because of the mortgage. And then you've got student debt as well. So it's just everyone's being enslaved by this system. We have more debt in the world than there is money to pay it off. And the only way this system can keep going is more and more lending by private banks. The only reason they'll lend is if there's more economic activity to provide money for. So therefore we have what's called a growth imperative. So although we may want in certain situations to grow economic activity, to increase economic activity, fine, if that's what people want to do. But we have a world system which requires growth to continue. And with the way the money system works, then the proceeds from those loans are entirely liquid, meaning they can go anywhere around the world and concentrate wherever. And so they end up concentrating in those financial speculative places. So then it ends up inflating the shares of Apple and Alphabet and Meta, and then they end up becoming the billionaire class. And as you know, they were the nerds in class who suddenly become billionaires, and everyone likes a billionaire because they think that's cool, and therefore the nerds start telling us how to live and what to believe and start trying to control our lives.
And you mentioned in the book also that the problem is that where do the banks and these people decide to put the money? Because they don't give the money to a chairman, you said in the book. They give the money to the immobile people who's building houses. So they are conducting also a way of a value in the world, no? What is valuable and what is not valuable, no? So
yeah, so as I say, money is purchasing power, and that includes the power to hire people. So money is the power to tell each other what to do. And therefore, if the origin of that new power to tell each other what to do is coming from banks, then it will create society in service of the needs of the banks. So therefore, we will see skyscrapers and condominiums more than we will see beautiful ecological permacultural spaces, because what's going to be more suited for a banker to get a good return? It's obvious. So that I have identified as the fundamental distortion of society globally, because we would always have some people who would be acquisitive, competitive, and actually maybe it's good that we always had some people in societies that were competitive and acquisitive. And the problem is if then we have a system where everyone is encouraged to be like that, and the people who are best at being like that are the most rewarded. And that's what has happened.
That's what has.
So I make the criticism at that level. It's almost like the operating code, the software of this economy. So I think if we just talk about capital and property ownership and all that, we're missing this deeper level. So I focus a bit more on that deeper level.
Yeah, and it's the same way going on with technology, that we are in Hypatia Foundation, we are very worried about this fanatism with this technological myth, and solutions. Everything has to be technological. And we are seeing many projects approved by governments and corporations without consultation to people. So we have to live in a digital world and in a technological world that it's an obligation. We haven't been consulted to live in this world that we are seeing, no? So, and sometimes this is making it worse because it's everything more expensive, needs more energy. So I want a reflection about this, no? This technological way of living.
Yeah, I have the privilege of some international travel to promote my book, and I am shocked at how cash has disappeared from societies around the world. And I do wonder what that means for the resilience of economic activity in terms of when there's power cuts to do with earthquakes, hurricanes, hacking attacks, all sorts of things that could come, viruses in the system. I don't mean natural, I mean computer viruses. And of course, what we don't realize is that every time we make a transaction with our card, there's about 5 or 6, depending on the way it works, 5 or 6 companies, many of which are international, which in those seconds of the transaction happening need to permit the transaction to happen. And any one of those can decide that you're not going to be able to do that today. And sometimes that happens. And sometimes that happens outside of any legal process. So, for example, famous and controversial WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks, not liked by Senator Joe Lieberman, so he managed to get, I think, SWIFT and a few other organizations just to switch them off. And then we saw that in Canada with the disputes with protests against some of the COVID policies, where then the government decided to get people switched off for their political activism, even if it was non-violent. So not terrorism, like you can understand if it's national security terrorism, but no, it's just we don't like your politics and your protest, a bit too noisy. So some people are waking up to that, that we are, some people call it turnkey tyranny. Through the way that technology has spread through our lives, I've given you one example with electronic payments, but how dependent we are on our phones, for example, how many of us need two-factor authentication to log into anything now. Well, that means, therefore, our telephone company can just cut us off from anything just like that. So, yeah, if people in power want to really disrupt our lives, they can do it to a degree that has
never been before.
Wasn't possible before, and just like that, and across the world. So yes, we do need to talk about that. It's not being talked about. Why is it not being talked about? We also therefore have the problem of our public sphere, meaning the way that we get to talk to each other, has been privatized to a level that we just didn't realize because it's become so digital. So 85% of all social media sharing in any language is owned by 3 American companies, Microsoft, Meta, and Alphabet, through Instagram, Facebook, WhatsApp. And you can see the amount of hassle that the companies in social media that aren't owned by those 3, how much hassle they get. TikTok and Twitter. We may not like TikTok or Twitter, but the fact they get so much hassle is a geopolitical motivation, because the amount of power in the hands of people who can then get Meta, Alphabet, and Microsoft to do what they want. And what do? They manipulate our experience of what the public sphere is. They manipulate what we see. They manipulate what we even see from our friends on social media. So that creates a false sense of what our community believes. It can all be managed and manipulated. So we are already in not a kind of a situation of an abusive tyranny where where people are being switched off for their views from their banking system so much, but we're already in a tyranny of where our public perceptions and our ability to dialogue about what's going on is now being manipulated in the interests of American global corporations and whoever has their ear, which might be certain American agencies, but also other governments that kind of manage to have that influence over them. So the technological, I've talked about freedom and rights in relation to what you're saying with technology. That's a different point to techno-fanaticism, I think. Techno-idolatry.
Idolatry. Like a religion.
So there's so many people, no matter what problem you talk about, will say, well, technology will fix it. It's the modern equivalent of saying, pray to Jesus. It is. It serves the same function. So yeah, it is techno-idolatry on anything, and I think we saw that with the pandemic. There was a belief that the brainy people who will develop the vaccines that will definitely work super fast and will fix it for us, and there was that hope and that waiting for that solution.
Yes.
Rather than thinking, well, what do we know that might work? More vitamin C, more zinc, more vitamin D, more ventilation, open the windows, get some HEPA filters in to clean the air so we're not breathing in each other's germs. Help people who've got symptoms stay at home rather than having to go to work because otherwise they won't have any money to, buy their food. That's all a lot more complicated and messy, and it requires trust in each other and dialogue. And yet, everyone was sold this idea, you just wait for the vaccine. It turns out the vaccines didn't stop transmission and infection. And yet we were told they were by many people, and people wanted to believe it. People wanted to believe there was a quick fix. And that's part of techno-idolatry. And we've got to be very careful of it.
Yes.
And we even got people thinking that what I'm saying, this is why it's a religion. People think what I'm saying is heresy. I should be damned to hell as a bad person because I'm saying this. That proves this isn't just rational. It's in the realm of religious belief.
Yes, and it's and not also that, but you have a quote in related to this subject in the book that says, policies imposed during the pandemic produced a record increase in the number of billionaires and their share of global wealth. In 2022, there were about 2,750 billionaires who own 3.5% of the world's wealth, while the poorest 50% of the world's population owed about 2% of its wealth. During the pandemic, billionaires accumulated 4.1 trillion, a period in which 100 million people were pushed into extreme poverty by government policies. So it's not just this group thinks and the other group thinks. It's just also there's business through technology behind, no?
Yes, so there were winners and losers from the orthodox pandemic policy response. The winners were Amazon and Zoom, all sorts. Also all your food delivery services. Just anyone who was involved in technology, they were the winners. Obviously, the pharmaceutical companies were the winners, getting huge payouts and immunity for what their products may or may not do to people. The losers were so many small businesses, artists, performers, all sorts. People who were on the edge of issues like alcoholism or mental health or domestic violence, they were the losers. Children who lost 1 to 2 years of their schooling and normal social development. Also, we now know that we have microplastics in the brain. We didn't realize that microplastics cross the blood-brain barrier. So having kids wear masks, those masks have plastic in them So it's not like these policies don't have some consequences. The consequences are not quite clear yet.
No.
And again, this problem, the problem is the hostility in this field, that we can't just look at, well, what went right, what went wrong. I think partly it's because a lot of people want to protect themselves and the decisions that they made, and they don't want to ask questions. They don't want to have an open debate about it.
Yeah.
So you're right. Massive transfer of wealth because of the pandemic policies. I don't go as far as saying what some conspiracy theorists say, therefore the pandemic was somehow invented in order to create this mass transfer of power and wealth. No, I just think we will continue to see problems in society like pandemics, and the policies seem to reflect the interests of the few. That's what's happening, and it seems that governments around the world are becoming more and more vulnerable to just being used to transfer public wealth into private hands. So it happened in 2008 with a huge amount of money transferred into the financial system, and then we've seen it with the pandemic, huge transfer of wealth into pharmaceuticals. We see it with, we've entered an era of perpetual scary war and the threat of escalation, transferring massive wealth into the military-industrial complex. And what's next? I would argue mass transfer of wealth into engineering companies to do stupid things like carbon capture and storage. So in the UK, they've just promised 22 billion to go to companies that are going to suck carbon out of the air. Total nonsense.
Yeah, so the collapse also includes then like the collapse of reflection. No, there used to be a time where politics were like, there was some philosophical reflection, and now we are just, as you said, transferring the power to companies or to outsource the solutions, and this not means how we think, a more coherent government. So what do you think is the blind spot that we are living? There's a blind spot because I don't believe everything is corruption or business between politicians and company leaders. Must be a lot of people trying to do the best they can, but there's a blind spot, an unconscious place that this is emerging. No, this is like the solutions are going there, like without reflection, deep reflection.
Two things that come to mind. I'm pro-technology. I'm fascinated about what we can do with technology. We're at Tecnológico de Monterrey. So for me, I'm critiquing who's in charge of the technology and why they use it. And, so for example, if we had companies developing vaccines where they were only focused on public health, then they wouldn't missell those vaccines, and they wouldn't rush them out with like kind of not really that safe studies. We don't really know why. Why would they do it? But if you're a big multinational who wants to get huge amounts of money from the government and have a big boost to your share price, then that is obviously involved in decisions about what we saw. So this is what I don't like, is that we're allowing the corporate motive to kind of distort how whether it's the public sphere through the big tech owning or owning or the private companies that own our newspapers, whatever. We're kind of allowing this corporate motive and way of behaving to distort everything, the way that we interact, so that people might think of me and think, is that anti-vax? Is he an anti-vaxxer? No, of course not. But I'm against, I'm pro-good vax, and I don't think rushing out vax just to make profits for Pfizer is actually good vax. So, good technology, bad technology, it depends on the incentives, it depends on the governance. So it's the same. We are losing the ability for open dialogue, scientific dialogue, policy scrutiny, accountability of power. We are losing that in many countries. And yes, you're right. That is, I argue in my book, an aspect, an accelerator of societal collapse. the way I would link it back to the monetary system, and therefore the monetary cause of the collapse, is the following. Since 2015, we hit peak crude oil. So crude oil, the most amount of energy that you can get for the least amount of energy you put in to get it. And so the energy return on the investment to get the energy has been declining from our energy mix since then. And so we're not peak oil generally, but what it means is that we have to work harder to get the same amount of energy into our society. And also we've hit ecological limits in many other ways. And we've trashed so many of the world's forests that it's more expensive to get the wood and so on. We have to put more and more fertilizers and pesticides and agrochemicals to get the same yields from degrading soils. So in the real world, real productivity, real wealth is more shaky. It's not, and we are in a system that requires constant economic growth. So what happens? We've had monetary engineering, financial engineering, where governments have stepped in to help create new amounts of money and just giving it away to initially since 2008 the financial system, and then since 2020 with COVID, directly to the corporate system with corporate bond buying. This means that the share price and performance of companies and financial institutions is becoming ever more separated from the real economy and how we experience wealth in our own lives of, healthy food, healthy environments, and free time, great friends, good fun. That's real wealth, not just sort of digits. What's my portfolio today? That's not wealth. The wealth is how we experience life. So there's this separating. We're getting an ever more abstract financial system. And what that means is also that's creating huge amounts of power in the hands of a few. And they are rightly scared, even if they don't admit it to themselves, about what's happening in the world. And I think they're going to make it worse, because one of the big things will be for them, how do they maintain and grow their power? Okay. Whereas actually what they need to do is just have a lot less power. But they think they're the ones to answer everything. That's why Bill Gates gets so much criticism, because he obviously is the kind of like the poster child for this, of the billionaire who now thinks that he has the answers to fix all the world's problems.
Yes. So let's go to something that appeared yesterday in Huerto Roma Verde's launch. That is, what is eco-libertarism? That it's a concept that we really loved in the book, and is your spiritual, way of showing or living a new way. As a community. What is eco-libertarism? Can you explain?
Sure. So for those people who are aware of the environmentally tragic situation we're in and the implications for society, that we're in a predicament, can't be fixed, for those people who see that, then if they don't have the deeper critique that I've explained in the book and today, so they don't see it as monetary and economic systems and power and how it's distorted our experience of life, how we've all been manipulated and coerced into being inquisitive, competitive, all that. If they don't have that, they end up thinking that the planet's being destroyed because humans are bad. And then that's one short step away from thinking, oh, but I'm good because I see that, and then me and people like me need to force all the bad people to change for their own good. And so then we see this already in many. It's explicit sometimes and not explicit in many times, but it's privately been a story I've heard from a lot of environmentalists. So it basically that leads to eco-authoritarianism, that we will need to enforce changes on people's lives, and other things like reducing poverty, protecting rights. All this is secondary to saving.
Like in COVID, yes.
Yeah, everything becomes secondary. And we see this explicitly now sometimes from some green politicians. They do say this. So they're talking in Germany about maybe banning cars from weekends and various different things. And the problem is that then it's seen as sort of, it's very elitist. And it's not looking at, where is the most destruction and damage coming from? Where's the most pollution coming from? And how are you going to help poor people cope with the cost of living crisis while also being a bit more green? It's not integrated. So for me, my view is something else, which is that I know that for hundreds of thousands of years, Homo sapiens, how long have we been around? A few 100,000 years? Homo sapiens lived okay. We evolved in harmony with the rest of life on Earth. There were times when we trashed nature, and then we learned, and so the whole story is what happened in North America, and then how they had to, societies collapsed and then reintegrated and learned from that. But we're here because we learned to be here and be compatible with nature. So there's nothing inherently toxic and disastrous about Homo sapiens. I would say that because we're here and we've been here for so long, and so there's nothing inherent. What's happened is we've ended up with a system that has fed certain aspects of our character and promoted people who have those aspects stronger in their character. Mm-hmm. And that's created a very destructive way of life, which is now collapsing in on itself. So therefore, I want to free people up to reimagine their relationship to each other and nature. So I want to remove the pressures for people to have to do jobs they don't like just to pay the mortgage or the rent. I want to remove the pressures on people and lack of freedom of people so they can't even have the chance to think about growing their own food because they can't afford the land and they don't have the time. I want people to be free to experiment with more harmonious ways of living in community in harmony with nature. And then we'll find out. I mean, to look at humanity in the city and say, oh, how unsustainable is, and that's the natural way of humans and it's destructive and therefore we must control them more, is like looking at, a zebra in a cage in a zoo and saying that's their natural way. We need to stop that zebra moving that way and make it move that way. I mean, it's not the natural environment. So that's the origin of eco-libertarianism as a philosophy. It's the opposite of eco-authoritarianism. I've set it up in that way. What's important is to note that in the Anglo-Saxon world, the concept of libertarianism has been captured by the right wing.
Yes.
Because of the dominance of American communications in the world. Mm. But the history of libertarianism is predominantly about the importance of personal sovereignty being achieved through collective action. And so left libertarianism, through collective action against the institutions that abuse their power, is the main historical form of libertarianism. And it's a bastard distortion, I would argue, of the American culture into right libertarianism, which is the one that, when I say bastard, I mean it's separated from the historical parentage. That's what I mean. It's kind of like just become this strange child that's not connected to the parent of the philosophy. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, in the Anglo-Saxon world, people think that I must be some right-wing strange person or because I'm using the word libertarianism. But that just shows you they don't know anything about political philosophy and history and the history of struggle. Some people also who do know about that history say, aren't you just rebranding anarchism? Mm-hmm. Aren't you rebranding anarcho-syndicalism? Aren't you rebranding communitarianism? Aren't you rebranding communism? And I say, well, no. It's definitely there's some resonance with anarcho-syndicalism and wanting people to own their own farms and factories and homes and not be in debt to overlords. Yes. Definitely there's some resonance with the constructive anarchist idea that we want to try and have communities having as much political power for themselves as possible. But no, I'm not against the nation state. I'm not against that you need to have some international power structures, but I just want them to be more accountable.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not, I respect Murray Bookchin and Proudhon and all these other great thinkers, but I'm not just repeating what they've said.
Okay.
That's for those of you out there who are into political philosophy and all
Yes.
that. Maybe what I just said sounded like mumbo jumbo, but some of you will understand.
Okay.
It's all in the book.
Yeah. In Cayendo Juntos, you also wrote, joy and personal fulfillment can be found by retreating from many aspects of consumer life. Tell us which of these aspects you are retreating now in your life, and if you are happier today living in Bali, you left your academic position in UK and you're living in close to a regenerative farm. So how to don't be part of the system or living the system is giving you joy.
What I didn't realize until I realized it was that I didn't have very good role models for successful, admirable older men. So throughout my career in NGOs, in consultancies, in UN, did a bit of politics. When I say older men, I guess I'm talking men in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, or 50s and 60s. The role model I had was someone in a smart suit who could afford very expensive shoes and probably drove a BMW. And who might walk past you in a hurry, and when you sat in a meeting with them, might be kind of, nice-ish, but there was a sense that you had to impress them according to a certain set of rules of performance. Okay. And so I think on some levels, I was scared of not being able to play that game. I was scared of not having the option of driving the BMW. Even though I was an environmentalist and I critiqued all of that, there was still part of me that wanted that as an option.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I'm so pleased I'm free of any of that nonsense now. So I think I'm free of any of that nonsense. So I've discovered that I want to be more playful as I get older, more curious as I get older, more approachable as I get older, more. This I haven't thought of this before, but because what I'm thinking is, what is the opposite of all those things I just said? Maybe more okay about, definitely more okay about not having a car or any of that. Yeah, I want to be free of all those stories and maybe be more the opposite of all those stories and maybe that people would point to that and say that, yeah, that's a very narrow version of patriarchy, what I've been describing. So, wow, I am so grateful to have discovered music music as a collective experience and a form of creation. So I don't mean discovered music like I've really got into that band and I can mix some songs and I go dancing. That for me is consumption still. I'm interested in the fact I can get together with a group of friends and we can sing and play songs together and we can hear a new song that one of us has done. That for me is what music means now.
Mm.
And now I realize that being into what I thought before was being into music was just still being into consumption. So yeah, I'm shifting in that way. I would like to think I'm going to get back into improv theatre, and therefore making stories together with people will be more a part of my life than watching them in a movie theatre.
Yeah.
Same idea.
Yeah. And this brings us to that we sometimes we think that the change that we have to do is very much outside, and we do so much effort to change with people or change the circumstances outside. But the change, it feels so different when the change is inside. And we in Hypatia are always speaking about how are we feeling these times in our these last 5 years, especially the change inside every person has been so strong. We are really changing our way of feeling, perceiving. Our consciousness is different than 5 years ago. So how do you have any practice or spiritual practice or meditation or teacher, or how do you have felt this process of inner change, with all that's going on right now, collectively, no?
What helped me a lot 6 years ago, when I was coming to these rather initially stressful conclusions. They were stressful not only for how I felt about my personal safety in the years to come and that of those I love and the wider human race, but they were stressful for my own story of why I'm a good guy and what my own personal career will be. When I was first coming to that, what was really important was restoring a sense of mystery and wonder of being alive. And I was super lucky to know people who were like very much their spirituality and their spiritual curiosity was most important to them and overt. So whether that's nature connection, organizing deep dives, inner child work, getting together and singing devotional songs, just all kinds of things. It wasn't your typical structure of, well, I'm a Catholic and I go to church and this is what we do, or I'm a Muslim or Christian, whatever. It wasn't that. It was people who were had a bit more of a. I mean, the negative story is, oh, this is like a spiritual supermarket. This is New Age, whatever. But the people I gravitate towards were people who were really taking this seriously as this is about discovering the nature of reality and honoring the fact that I'm alive and I'm wanting to live from the heart. So I gravitate towards those people who are then maybe experimenting and exploring different, what's Hindus got? What do Hindus say about this? And what does that guru say? Or what does Buddhism teach me on this? And so I was very lucky back 6 years ago. And I was also very lucky to discover a more feminine spirituality embodied by women naturally, whereby it challenged my assumption that I need to work everything out with language and concept, and I need to be very clear on everything and have everything correct. There was an embrace of the mystery and the incomprehensibility of the life experience. And there was a much greater attention to how a craving for safety and status was secretly driving everything. So that came from wise women in my life of different ages around then as well. But since then, what helps me? Two things. I'm in a devotional cacao ceremony band, and that we gather every 2 weeks, and so that's a form of ceremony, a form of connection. We do some guided processes to check in with what do we want to let go of, what do we want to invite back into our life. So that's a form of ritual that I don't otherwise have in my life, which is quite a nice retuning, resetting. And it's also a joyful celebration of just this crazy experience of life. And then also every 2 to 3 months, I co-lead a meditation retreat at a Buddhist temple. And the crucial part of that is we go offline. We have to hand in our telephones. So we have 3 nights, 4 days there. And unlike a typical Vipassana, where you're kind of not meant to do much thinking or writing, we not only have the silent meditation and the walking meditation, but we also encourage people to bring a book and to do free writing. So there's time set aside where write, even if you don't know what you're going to write, start writing like, even I don't know what I want to write about, because, and you just discover what's inside, and it invites this awareness. It's almost like the meditation is like a muddy pond, and it's just letting the sediment settle, and then you can see more about what's happening in your life, what your emotions are, what's bothering you about the world, or your, whatever's happening. And so actually allowing the process of writing to help you with that. And then we have some guided dialogues. And what's awesome is we have spiritual singing in the evenings. So it's the best way of living, because it's silent. Silent meditation retreat, but you only open your mouth to sing.
Oh, how nice.
But if it wasn't, I think if I didn't have that every 2 to 3 months over the last 3 years, the book wouldn't exist as it does, maybe not at all. Probably wouldn't at all. I would have just stitched together a few of my old writings, and so then I wouldn't have been so proud of it. I wouldn't have felt that it's such a contribution of me and my everything I could offer to the world, and therefore I wouldn't be here because I wouldn't be that bothered by it. So yeah, I think that taking time away, and also that was in the context of a faith tradition, which is quite amazing, Buddhism and the teachings and insights of Buddhism. So yeah, that's big.
Great, Jem. Okay, yeah, to finish, I want to finish with this, mentioning Latin American indigenous wisdom that is always reminding us, to the little brothers, as the mamos in Colombia call us, to the white people. They are always reminding us to listen to the earth, to stop and come back home to be one again, and letting go our illusion of supremacy and dominant position, and coming back home, coming back to our common heart. And I want to ask you, Jem, how the deep adaptation movement and your Cayendo Juntos book can help us, or is helping us coming back home through collapse.
So, to conclude that modern societies are breaking down is a huge conclusion to reach. And so maybe the worst thing to do is for people to think they know this. Oh, this is a view, this is a topic, there's some evidence for it, some people are thinking that way. And you put it over there and you get on with your life. It's too important for that, because if what I'm saying is true, then it does affect the rest of your life. It means that things are going to get worse, and what you're working towards and what you're saving for, what your expectations are no longer valid. What you respect or defer to no longer should be assumed. So, wow, if you come to that conclusion, then naturally it's like, why did we screw this up so bad? And then it's an invitation to ask these much deeper questions. Because I've pointed to the money system, but I've pointed how the money system has manipulated us and promoted certain aspects and ways of being over So yeah, therefore, it completely challenges us to drop our assumptions that we've learned from birth in modern societies. That humans are different and better and special and in charge and have a destiny to just dominate the planet. That's, by the way, a mistranslation of the ancient biblical texts. And I talk about that, I think, in the book. I actually quote from some of the original scripts and how they were mistranslated to give the impression that we're in charge and it's our destiny to be in charge rather than to be with the rest of life on Earth. So then, once there's that collapsing or loosening of those ideas, also the loosening idea of the idea that we'll forever progress, and that technology is a tool in that forever progression, where to look? What to help in that vacuum? Well, it seems to make sense to listen to those people who have been telling us this forever. So, the people that you talk to a lot, the people that still have presence here in Latin America, and some people still listen to them, and some people still live in solidarity with them, and are trying to protect them from rapacious industrial capitalism and what's been done, the theft of their destruction and poisoning of their land. So yes, a big part of the deep adaptation agenda and a message in my book is to recenter indigenous wisdoms, plural, and of course remember that there are indigenous wisdoms that have been crushed in Europe. They're more of a distant memory, but it's there. And I actually also think that Buddhism is a form of an indigenous wisdom that's survived in a certain form. And if you look beneath the symbols, these sort of cultural artifacts, and you actually go to the deeper messages, and some of the practices, they're getting at the same thing, which is to quieten the stories. So if we quieten the mind, we're quietening the stories of our culture. If we slow things down, we can spot how our emotions shape our thoughts. Therefore, we can spot the terror of a feeling of separation, and therefore the terror of death or of not being safe. If we can spot all that and quieten it down, if we can encourage altered states in each other where we don't operate from that deep level fear of thinking that we're separate and we need to be safe and we need to make sure we don't die yet, if we can get out of that into a different consciousness, then there's a whole different way of experiencing reality and choosing how to live. And I think so many of the different ancient traditions and indigenous wisdoms are getting at that.
Totally.
Really? You think you're the one who knows about this?
Yes, I totally agree. And I think that we are done. We would like to thank to all the people who's looking at this interview. Thank you so much, Jem. Thank you so much for being here in Mexico. It has been great all these days with him. And goodbye. Thank you very much for being here.
Thanks for watching.